Thank you, Rick, and everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you here this afternoon, and to start by saying a big thank you to Yale. This actually has been my privilege to have been associated with such a wonderful institution of learning, my privilege to have been taught by so many great students, my privilege to have been working with and under the guidance of President Levin, who is an exceptional leader in my view, and someone you should be very glad you've got in charge of your university. He also introduces me always in a really kind way. Yes, it's true, we had 10 years of record growth when I was British Prime Minister. I have unfortunately come to the conclusion subsequently that it was luck. However, it did indeed happen. One of the things that this course that we have been, which I'm talking to you a little bit about, this course on faith and globalization has arisen out of a particular passion. In fact, I would say for me, the central passion of my life, which is the belief that religious faith has a progressive and important role to play in the future, but only if people of different faiths are prepared to live and work together in peaceful coexistence. And I thought I'd just start by I'm going to say a little bit about the course and what we've learned, and then I'm going to try and apply that to some of the practical political questions that we face today. But just to give you a sort of insight into how I see the world, I think I can best do that to begin with just by a little travelogue of where I've been in the last few months. In August, I attended for a week the Beijing Olympics, which was this extraordinary spectacle and this amazing bird's nest stadium, and saw the emerging power and might and confidence of China, and reflected on how power is shifting eastwards the whole time. And then the next month, just as I was leaving to go to New York, the news about the collapse of Lehman Brothers was on the television screen. And here's the interesting thing. You know, I was watching the popular TV news channel, not the kind of intellectual one that small numbers of people watch, but the popular one that large numbers of people watch. And there they were, top story, collapse of Lehman Brothers. And I was kind of reflecting that an institution no one in the UK had even heard of a short time ago suddenly was leading the popular news program in every corner of the United Kingdom. Indeed, actually, as I was leaving the house that morning to get into the car to go to the airport, there was a guy who recognized me, actually stopped me and said, "Here," he said, "who are these brothers anyway?" And then, just a short while after that, I was sitting in a tent in Libya with Colonel Gaddafi. Have I ever told you about this? No. So there I was, out in Libya. Well, I say a tent. It was actually about the size of this chapel, actually. So it was quite large. But the thing is, in fact, I'm about to give you some excellent advice on what not to say in these circumstances. Every so often, a camel's head would kind of attach to the body, would kind of poke in, the inside of the tent. And here's what not to say. If you are asked, have you ever tried camel's milk? Do not say, no, I don't think I ever have. Right. What you say in those circumstances is, Yes, of course. Yes, many times. Anyway, I gave the wrong answer. The camel was sort of taken around the back of the tent or wherever. A bit of milking went on, or whatever you do. I'm not quite sure what you do with a camel, but I suppose it must be something like that. And back came 2 steaming glasses of camel's milk, one for me, one for the leader, Gaddafi. So I take a little sip of it. He says, no, it's not how you drink it. You drain it, the glass all the way out. So I drained it. And the thing is, that is the fastest moving stuff you will ever taste. Yeah. So anyway, but the real point about the visit was that there I was talking with Colonel Gaddafi, and here's somebody whose name was synonymous with terrorism 20 years ago, sitting there telling me that we should wake up, that this terrorist threat was causing trouble all over his region, that people from the Tuareg tribe were pouring in over the border from Algeria. And it just came home to me in each of these 3 incidences, the power shifting to the east and the emergence of China, the global economic crisis, sitting with someone who used to be a symbol of terror, talking about the danger of it, and realized that the world in which we live today is indeed interconnected, interdependent, and interrelated. And that has got major implications of how we organize human affairs. And so at one level, to conduct a course here at Yale about faith and globalization, you might say, well, why? In fact, a lot of people did say why. And I always remember seeing a close friend of mine who's a rough and tough business guy who'd been very successful in the UK, a Cockney. And he, just after I left office, and once we decided to do the course at Yale, and he said to me, so what are you doing with your new life then? And I said, well, the first thing is I'm trying to solve the Middle East peace process. He said, oh, I wouldn't try that, mate. It's hopeless. They all hate each other. And he said, what's the second thing? And I said, well, what I'm trying to do is to bring the religious faiths of the world together. He says, you what? He says, what's the third thing? And I said, the third thing is that I'd like to do a bit of business. He said, oh, I thought you'd gone completely crazy there for a minute, mate. And the reason is very, very simple, that I wanted to do this because, in my view, the key to understanding the modern world is that the pressures of it are pushing people together. That is what globalization does. It operates to obliterate national boundaries. It operates through all sorts of ways, travel, communication, the internet, mass migration, to push people together. And if religious faith becomes a means of pulling people apart, then religious faith becomes a source of conflict and division. Now, that is bad for everyone. But for people of religious faith, it's particularly bad, because it then means that faith becomes synonymous not with reconciliation and compassion and justice and all the things that really true religious faith should stand for, but becomes synonymous with division and conflict and hatred and sectarianism. So the reason for the course may seem at one level intellectual and academic, but at another level is severely practical, because unless we find a way of reconciling faith and globalization, the world will be a more dangerous place, and actually, as I shall argue, a less successful as well as a less just place. Or at least I got sort of 10 lessons, which I'll run through very quickly, which I explained to the students on the course today, 10 things that have stood out to me from the discussions we've had on faith and globalization. And incidentally, I would like to echo what Rick said in thanks of Miroslav Volf, who's just been a wonderful person to work with. And, you know, after a lifetime in politics, it's kind of great to hear intelligent analysis. And you know, thank you, Miroslav, for that. So here are the things that the lessons that I've drawn out of this. One, faith matters and it motivates. Whether people like it or they don't like it, millions, billions of people are motivated in their lives by religious faith. Two, faith is not in decline. It's in decline in some places, but it's not in decline worldwide. Indeed, in some parts of the world, it is growing. Three, religious faith can operate positively in support, for example, of the Millennium Development Goals, wonderful work being done by churches and mosques and Jewish Hindu relief, or it can operate negatively through fundamentalism and extremism. Fourth, globalization is helping create multi-faith societies. If you look at the London that my little boy is growing up in, it's a London that's completely different from the London of 30 years ago. And same here in this country too, I've no doubt. Globalization is helping create a multi-faith society. And five, to work effectively, however, globalization needs values like trust and confidence and openness and justice. And I shall try to argue why that is true when we come to consider the practical implications of the economic crisis. 6, faith is not the only means, but it is an important means of providing those values. If faith is itself open and not closed, and if it is based on the values of compassion and help for other people, and not on the basis of exclusionary identity. 7, that the goal of faith, and possibly, arguably, of globalization, is human flourishing, and that spiritual capital is an important part of social capital. In other words, the way the faith community operates within a society and the spiritual capital derived from it is an important part of the social capital that both defines and enriches the society in which we live. 8, in an era, however, of globalization and multi-faith societies, creating such spiritual capital requires not only tolerance of, but respect for people of other faiths. In other words, if globalization is pushing people together and we're creating multi-faith societies, then the only way that spiritual capital enriches society is if people of different faiths not just tolerate each other, but respect each other. 9, that the key to respect is understanding, and hence the need to learn and to educate. And 10, organized religion should be supporting this process and allowing through it the evolution of faith so that faith can be indeed a positive, constructive, and progressive force in an era of globalization. So, the reason why I think this is such an important area for modern society and the way that it functions is that faith matters and values matter, and how those combine in an era of globalization will critically define the success, the prosperity, as well as the peaceful coexistence of the society in which we live. And that is because, as you could see from my short travelogue of my experiences, that interaction, interrelation, interdependence creates the circumstances in which, if people of different faiths and cultures cannot work and live together, then that becomes a major source of conflict that then reacts against the force of globalization and creates tension, difficulty, and even violence. Now, briefly, let me just apply that to practical politics. One of the great things about this course has been that you actually do learn from the students. I mean, you're right. That's why I said, I was educated by them rather than them educating me. Although I was pleased to see that by the end of the course, when Miroslav used to introduce me as Professor Blair, they stopped laughing. But here's the thing. During the course of one of our initial discussions, I was arguing that globalization is essentially a process that is kind of value-free, and that actually whether it works or not economically doesn't really depend on values. Now, you can argue that globalization should have justice going with it for reasons of justice, but not necessarily for reasons of efficiency. And I was challenged on that, and I came to the conclusion, actually, that the student was right. And I think this global economic crisis is interesting at a number of different levels, and incidentally, very challenging, all of them. But actually, if you think about it, it is first and foremost a crisis that has been brought about in part by behavior that we wish hadn't taken place, and it is being prolonged by the absence of confidence that means people are not sure that they can have faith in the system. I mean, faith not as religious faith, but trust in it. And therefore, I would argue that as we try and look forward to how we put our economies back on a sound footing for the future, values like trust, being able to rely on the other person's word, real asset values, some sense of the long-term as well as short-term profit maximization, that these values actually are the things that can create confidence and therefore stability in that system as we move forward. And so, although it would be very possible to say, let's treat this as a technical economic question, what is the technical answer in regulatory terms to prevent such a crisis happening again? What are the reasons why the crisis has happened? You can look at it in purely technical terms. But the end product of the global economic crisis was that even people who worked alongside each other for years in financial institutions could not trust the bond of the other. And I actually think one of the interesting things, therefore, about the world of interdependence is that it cannot function without a strong set of values underpinning it. And I think you can see that even through this global economic crisis. But if you turn to foreign policy, you see it even more clearly. The security threat we face can be described in many different ways. Personally, and sometimes controversially, I see what is happening recently in Mumbai and those people who died in that terrorist attack there, and what happens in other parts of the world, all part of the same security threat. And it's all part of one thing, in my view. It's why, as I think I said when we were having the more open meeting last time, people sometimes say to me, should we worry about Afghanistan rather than Iraq, or Pakistan rather than Iran, and I'm afraid, in my view, you have to worry about all of these things together because they're all part of the same thing. And it's true that one part of the answer is that where we're challenged militarily, we've got to be prepared and be able to respond militarily. But it's also true that it will be the force of ideas rather than the force of arms that allows us to succeed. And that is why, for example, the Middle East peace process, if we were able to secure peace between Israel and Palestine, that would be of enormous importance, a huge symbolic expression that would militate against the violence and division and the things that inspire people to commit acts of terrorism in the name of God. If we were able, as we're trying to do here, to create a space for people of different faiths to come together and work together, live together peacefully, it would be a powerful demonstration of a different set of values set alongside those of exclusion and division. Education will become a major component of foreign policy if we want to be able to defeat this terrorist threat that now strikes at virtually every single part of the world. So what I would say is that this security threat, yes, is about military means and security and all the different issues that dominate the headlines, but it's also, critically, about being able to demonstrate support for values of peaceful coexistence that can be set us against what is undoubtedly otherwise a narrative of division and conflict that unfortunately has an enormous reach into different parts of the world. Now, I therefore think that the consequence of interdependence in economic policy and in foreign policy is that unless we have strong values guiding both sets of policies, they cannot be effective. And for that to work, for that idea, if you like, of peaceful coexistence to take root, we need alliances and multilateral institutions, and we need values that are shared and held in common. Now, the alliances can be very difficult. I think it was Oscar Wilde or Churchill that once said that we're two nations divided by a common language. That's my nation and yours, but if you try it in Europe, it can be even more difficult. Forgive me if I've ever told you, I don't know if I've ever shared this one with you, Rick, but when I speak a bit of French. In fact, I thought I did speak French quite well until the particular incident I'm about to tell you about, which is I decided to do early on in my premiership a live press conference. Have I told you? Did I tell you the last time? Yeah, all my stories, yeah. And I was I did a live press conference with the French Prime Minister in French, and I was asked by a French journalist were there any policies of the French Prime Minister I desired to emulate. I got the term avoir envie wrong, and so instead of saying there are many policies of the French Prime Minister I desire to emulate, I said that I desired the French Prime Minister in many different positions. So, which was difficult to recover from in the course of that press conference, I have to say. So it can be hard enough getting the right alliances within Europe, but truthfully, we need Europe and America to revitalize the transatlantic alliance, and then we need, for both of them, to get the right relationship with China, that is going to be such an important power, and with India and Russia and other of the emerging powers in the world. And here's the other thing. There is no way that that common value system that we need to make those alliances successful is going to happen unless we are clear that our values are not just about democracy and freedom, but are also about justice. That's why, for me, Africa is a moral cause, but it's also a cause that is in our enlightened self-interest. That is why climate change and dealing with the problems in the environment has to be done on a basis that is fair and equitable to the developing as well as the developed world. In other words, the problems that we face today cannot be solved except on the basis of alliances that are global, and those alliances will only work if they're on the basis of values that are also global. So, come back to faith and globalization in conclusion. Faith can help. It's not the sole source of values. There are many people who are of no faith or anti-faith, but who have great values and do great work. But the faith communities can provide a solid foundation of values and a solid basis of common endeavor based on those values. But only if faith is not about our traditions and it's not about our identity, but it's about our values. It's about values of the common good and compassion and justice and humankind and our obligation, irrespective of nation, race, creed, religion, color, to acknowledge the equal dignity and equal worth of every individual before God. So I see this faith and globalization course that I've had the privilege to be part of this year as really one of the most important things we can possibly do for the future. We've got great ambitions now to expand it too, and I will actually have my own faith foundation. I'll have people here that are based at Yale for next year. We've got really exciting programs for research, for linking up with other universities, for doing major forums and conferences on the relationship between business and faith, and good commercial ethics and faith. How this 21st century develops is hard to predict. But one thing for sure is true, that whether it evolves in a way that is peaceful, in a way that inures to the prosperity and benefit of all people, depends not simply on impersonal mechanisms of the market or the desire for material advancement alone, but also depends vitally and critically on the beliefs we have, the convictions we hold dear, and the values that we share. And if religious faith could at least not be a hindrance to such a coming together, that would be a great thing. But how much better it would be if you are of religious faith, if it was not merely not a hindrance, but it was an active, visible, participating support for creating a world in which what we want for ourselves, we want for others, and are prepared to act in order to achieve it. Thank you.
Well, we have a little bit of time for a conversation, and I'm aided here by a few questions from the audience and a few of my own. Maybe we'd start, I think it would be interesting to call on your experience, say with Northern Ireland, to dig a little more deeply into the question of how can faith, or at least religious tradition, play a role in reconciliation. You brought that piece about, I know you would say many people brought it about, but you've played a key role in bringing it about by appealing to religious leaders on both sides of the divide. And I guess my question is a little bit of a hard question, is do you think that your success really depended upon appealing to values rooted in faith, as you talk about so eloquently, or were you really dealing with sort of pragmatic political leaders of communities that happen to be defined by two religious groups? So, and was it more that your success depended on the moral authority those individuals had as leaders of communities, or was it really rooted in some sense in deeper values that emanated from religious traditions? Were you able to make the appeal based on religious ideas?
I don't think you can you hear me in this?
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually don't think you can divide the two very easily, to be honest. Mm-hmm. And for sure, in Northern Ireland, there were people of religious faith who really helped, and people of religious faith who really didn't. But the ones that helped were of massive benefit, because they were able to stand up and say, our faith should tell us not to do these acts of violence, but instead should tell us to reconcile. And here's what's really interesting about this, that sometimes people say to you about a dispute like Northern Ireland, indeed they say it actually about the Israel-Palestine thing to an extent too, they say it's not religious at all, it's all political. And you have to say to them, but unfortunately a lot of the people who are engaged in it think it is religious. So if you leave aside religion, you leave aside part of the analysis of the problem and therefore part of the solution. Mm-hmm. So I found that, yeah, it was dramatically important at certain points, and that's why it was great on the course, incidentally. We had two, a Catholic and a Protestant, a Catholic priest, Protestant vicar over as part of the course, which was interesting, and I think the students found it useful too.
Right. What about in the Middle East? Here, you need to hook that over your ear.
I think
there you go. I got it.
I've not had one of these before, but anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To what extent could an appeal to religious leaders, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish, play a role in the resolution of the Middle East dispute? We've talked a little bit about this in connection with Jerusalem. Is there a role for that channel as opposed to the governmental leaders of Palestine and Israel? Lebanon,
yeah, there is,
Syria?
of course, because the religious leaders can say, actually, we should be trying to live with one another and get on with one another. And in respect of Jerusalem, there is going to be no solution to Jerusalem unless it is an open city, at least in terms of faith. Mm-hmm. In one of the things that's really... do you mind if I stand to answer the questions?
This is what bothering you. Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, because it's just, after Prime Minister's questions, I always kind of... Not that you're not a lot politer, at least so far, than they used to be. Yeah, that's a bit better. It's you're not going to have a solution to Jerusalem unless it's a place where people of different faiths can worship. And just when I was there a short time ago, my office is just up the road from the old city, and sometimes when you drive past it, you see very obviously Jewish people, very obviously Muslim people, less obviously, but probably kind of Christian tourists. Actually, when I was there the other day, suddenly some people who were obviously Hindu, I thought, from India sort of drifted by, and you thought, whoa, what's going on? But, you know, it's a place where people come who are of spiritual faith. So yes, it could, and what's more, and this is the important thing that I was saying in my point 10, which is for organized religion to play a positive part. Organized religion's got to accept its responsibility in the interfaith world and not kind of say, well, let the politicians go and deal with that. Actually, they should be part of dealing with it. And I think there are a lot of enlightened people within organized religion today who do precisely that.
When you answered questions in the House of Commons and stood, did the backbenchers sit or stand?
Sorry, I'll come and sit down.
No. I'll get up and stand with you if you like.
Actually, it wasn't whether they were sitting or standing, really. It was the general abuse with which they would. But anyway.
Okay. Okay. Well, this is distinctly non-abusive questioning. So let's talk about India for a minute. The President Bush famously said that India is a country with 300 million Muslims and not a single member of Al Qaeda. And yet, you know, just a week after you and I were in India this November, there was a terrible terrorist episode. How much, and this is a question from the audience, I mean, to what extent do you believe that that attack will really set back the cause of pluralism and religious toleration within the Indian nation?
Well, here's the thing. It's designed to do that, for sure. Right. So our response should be to stop that happening. I mean, the worst terrorist act in Northern Ireland, in terms of the single biggest loss of life in one incident, happened actually after the Good Friday Agreement, the Omagh bomb in 1998, 10 years ago. And there was a point of decision for the whole of the community and for the political world. The purpose of the act was to cause hatred, was to say to people, this process is hopeless, and therefore to get everyone to give up. And I went out straight away because I knew I had to say this immediately and said, this is the reason to carry on, so that these people do not win, so that these people do not own this process. And that is still absolutely necessary. So in India, yes, of course, the very purpose of this, I mean, the random killing particularly, you know, and let's be clear again, what is terrible about these events is that even in their own terms, of course, they're terrible, but actually the majority of people who died will have been Indians. You know, so even if their purpose was to take it out on Americans or British or Christians or Jews, actually the majority of people will have been ordinary Indians. The purpose of the terrorism is to create that conflict and hatred and to provoke the counter-reaction. And that is why it is so important, one, that the faith communities in those circumstances stand up and proclaim, we will not be intimidated into hating each other. On the contrary, we will regard it as a part of our faith to reach out to the other person, and secondly, that they do so in practice. But I'm afraid this is a problem the world over, and as we were saying in our class earlier today, in my view, this terrorism is unfortunately a very powerful modern weapon in the hands of an extremist. And it is for this reason that what these groups of terrorists actually understand now is that they can obliterate the news with pictures of carnage. And so whatever message you've got of reconciliation is never going to be powerful enough to compete with blood strewn across the television screen. And they know that, and they do that, and it catches the agenda. And of course, what it also does, because of this very issue we're talking about of interdependence and globalization today, as opposed to 30, 40 years ago, an act of violence happens, and it's live on our, people followed in Britain, in America, right around the world, they followed the unfolding of the events in Mumbai live on television. And so it has an immediate impact, and that's why they do it. But it's why we've got to be strong enough to stand up against it and point that out.
So here's another question from an audience member. Do you think that terrorist attacks, and the one in India would be an interesting case, but in general, do you think that terrorism today is more driven by religious extremism or by economic deprivation? And what would be the best, depending on your answer, what's the best approach to counter it?
Well, I have a very clear belief that the more prosperous people are and the better educated, and education, incidentally, I think is as important as prosperity in this regard. The better educated, the more prosperous, the more peaceful. That's my basic view. However, you cannot say, unfortunately, that everyone engaged in this terrorism is doing it for reasons of economic deprivation, because they're not. I mean, in the UK, the terrorist attacks were led by someone who is a teacher.
Yeah.
You can't.
But is it a passion for social justice and the correction of economic disparities that's more at stake than religious fanaticism?
Personally, I think it sometimes wears that suit of clothes, but I don't think it's driven by that. I think it's driven by a narrative, in this case about Islam, which is that the problems of Islam are really as a result of the complicity of Islamic leaders with the West, that Islam and the West are set against each other, and that peaceful coexistence is impossible.
You talked some about, in your speech, about values and trust, and I think we all understand that the resolution of the current economic crisis is going to require not just, I quite agree with you, it's not just a matter of technical economic analysis, it's a matter of restoring confidence, confidence of people in our institutions and our policies. When we did the panel in Wolsey Hall on September 19th, you, without naming names, I asked you about how does a party of the left win an election in a democracy, and you said that the candidate needs to move toward the center in order to win. That was about 6 weeks before the election. And so I ask you first, do you think that Obama took your advice and in the close of the election moved toward the center? And second, how do you think he's doing now, where clearly the biggest issue in front of him immediately is going to be reacting to the economic crisis? And is he positioning himself in the right way to tackle that important problem?
Well, I think in respect to the first, I think the economic crisis did change politics everywhere. Mm-hmm. And I also think it probably somewhat moved it left, if it moved it in any direction. Mm-hmm. In the sense that suddenly markets were not so much in fashion, government and the state came back into fashion.
So he didn't have to move to the center, the issues moved to the left.
I think they did a bit,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, honestly, they did a bit, to some extent at least. And also, incidentally, I think the calmness with which he dealt with the economic crisis made a difference too. Mm. But nonetheless, I think what is important and why I think his choices on the economic side are also good is that the purpose of government intervention should actually be to get the free enterprise system back on its feet, not to wipe it out, in my view, because I think that would be a big mistake. I mean, people do, it's like there's an old friend of mine, when I was at university, we used to go on demonstrations together, which is, it's quite interesting as a leader. You remember, you used to demonstrate against them, and now you get the demonstrations against you. It's the way it happens. But so we used to be on sort of, when I was very much on the left, we used to go on demonstrations together. And most of the people I was on demonstrations with on the left ended up working for merchant banks. But actually, this particular guy stayed true all the way through, and I bumped into him the other day, and he said, I told you capitalism would fail, and it has. So, there's a great kind of sense of Schadenfreude in certain parts of the political system. That, they've been waiting for this all this time, but I actually think it's a matter of making the free enterprise system work better, not actually changing it fundamentally. And as for the way that the president-elect has handled it, I think his appointments have given a lot of confidence to people, and his election was an amazing event around the world, for sure. And I actually think you in America should be really, really proud, both of the way the election happened, the fact of the election of President-elect Obama, the election of Barack Obama, and also what was an immensely gracious concession speech by John McCain. And I think the combination of those two things, I think, did America a power of good around the world and really, really helped bring out what I think people in their heart of hearts always knew, which is the best of America there for the world to see, and I think you should be really proud of it.
Another passion of yours that, in fact, you and I share is the recognition that we need to do something dramatic to arrest the course of climate change. And yesterday, President Obama appointed, perhaps to my personal taste, the best of the people he's appointed yet, in Stephen Chu as Secretary of Energy, a brilliant scientist who has devoted the last 10 years of his life to research leading to alternative energy technologies, and who's a passionate advocate for global action on climate change. Do you think that the current economic crisis is going to be an impediment to making progress on climate change, or can it be somehow turned to advantage?
Well, it could be an impediment, and it should be turned to advantage. Look, this is a very difficult question, as all these questions are. In fact, I think one of the things that's really interesting about the election of Barack Obama is that, I kind of know of how it feels to be in the position where you've got these enormous expectations. And the problem is the expectations change, but the problems don't. And I remember being in New York shortly after November the 4th and his victory. And there was a woman said to me, "Isn't it fantastic?" She said, "Everything is now possible." And I said, "Like what?" And she said, "Everything." And I remember, myself when I was elected as Prime Minister, and one of the curious distinctions with us is we go straight in to take office. And I remember going down to the cabinet room straight in after the election, and there was the cabinet secretary, who's the main civil servant and who's a career civil servant. We don't have political appointments in the same way that you do here. Just sort of sitting there in the cabinet room. It was my first time in the cabinet room. And he just sort of looked at me and said, "Well, you've won the election. Well done. Now what?" And people would sort of, we had a big healthcare problem at the time, and people would kind of take your hand and say, "I know you're going to sort this out for us." And I'd say, "Thank you." And they'd and I was kind of, "Yeah, but I need a plan, and I just need this effusion of goodwill." So I think for him, on the issue to do with climate change and the environment, what I was saying to some of my colleagues in Europe a short time ago is, let's stop asking what he's going to do for us and ask what we're going to do for him. Because if he's going to lead the way for a global deal, he's going to need to have China and India and the developing world in it. Now, we've got to find a fair way to do that, but there's no way he can stand up to the American people and say, "I'm going to take really radical action here, but I don't know what anyone else is going to do." It's going to be tough. So I actually think the appointments are good, but we need to get the best global deal we can, and I think it's important America leads in that way to get it. But I also think the important thing is to set the world on a new path towards reducing our dependence on carbon. And whatever else we do, just remember this, but it will require bold leadership by Barack Obama and by other leaders too. Okay, the price of oil's fallen, but it's not so very long ago that it was sky high. So let's not forget that. And let's make sure that we use this as an opportunity to invest in an energy future that allows us to grow sustainably and does not carry on in a way that is unsustainable, actually for our energy security, for our living standards, and for the planet. So that's what I would say.
Personally, I think we ought to make it impossible for people to forget where the price of gas was by putting a carbon tax into the recovery package. But that's a personal view. I'll ask perhaps one more question from the audience, and then I'll, as is usually the case, I'll throw you a really tough question at the end. This one's kind of cute, actually. How do you think future historians will rate your tenure as Prime Minister and your tenure at Yale?
I think they'll rate one of them well. But which is the question? Do you mind, when people talk about the judgment and reflection on your time in office, I remind, I think it was Chu Enlai in the 1970s was asked for his views on the French Revolution. He said it's too early to tell. I don't think it'll be that long, but I don't know. I think that in the end you make that judgment, I'm afraid, with a little distance of time, because you've got to see domestically whether the reform programs you put in place work or not, and certainly in foreign policy terms whether the military engagements, Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, stand the test of time or not. Now, undoubtedly, we made big changes as a government, but you know, the judgment on all of that put together, I don't know. And as for Yale, I don't know really. I mean, look, whatever your judgment is about me, I have to say, I really mean this. I've been amazingly impressed by you guys. And incidentally, I hadn't realized that, is the bulldog that's a Yale thing, is it?
It is.
Did you not borrow that from the British? I mean, the British got a bulldog. Now, I was saying to my staff, is there anything I can say, you know, that's kind of Yale-like? And they said, what is it?
You got it?
Go Bulldogs? Or?
Go Bulldogs? Bula Bula. How about Bula Bula? You could say that. Bula Bula. You may not want to say that.
Right, anyway, but that's why it's important that different cultures realize their differences as well as try and work together.
Okay, here's the hard one. What did you think of the portrayal of Tony Blair in The Queen?
Now, you're not going to believe this. I've never seen it. But I want to tell you why I've never seen it, and I will share this with you. That when the movie came out, I had my weekly audience with the Queen. I mean, the Queen. So I go into the room, and as you do every week, we sit down opposite each other. And she said to me, there's a film. I said, yes, Your Majesty. And she said, I don't think I'm going to watch it. How about you? That's honestly good. So, anyway, there it is. I should just, one other little thing is my wife, however, did watch it, And there is one thing that I can tell you is inaccurate, and I will now tell you the truth, which is about when we have this ceremony of kissing hands. Have I ever told you this?
Nope.
What happens when you go straight in to become Prime Minister after you win the election is you have a ceremony with the Queen, which is a ceremony of kissing hands. And until you've kissed hands, then you're not Prime Minister, right? Because the Queen's the head of state. You're just the head of government, right? You're a pleb, in other words. Your position is very properly dictated by the scheme of things. So you go in and you have the ceremony of kissing hands. And because it's straight after the election, I go along to Buckingham Palace. And I'm really tired because we've been up all night. We just won the election and it's all great and everything, but I'm kind of thinking about government and so on and so forth. And then I go and this little ante-room just outside the throne room where the Queen is. And there's this guy who's the sort of one of these Lord Chamberlain types who's sort of standing there, very in the sort of full gear and everything. And he says to me, Mr. Blair, you're now about to engage in the ceremony of kissing hands. I want you to understand, however, that you don't actually kiss the Queen's hands. You brush them lightly with your lips. So, I mean, this is what centuries of aristocratic inbreeding does to you. So I'm gonna, as you guys remember, so I'm kind of puzzling about this. What on earth does he mean? Brush, when the doors flung open and in I go. And I'm so sort of discombobulated by the whole thing and fatigue and whatnot that I miss my footing. I trip over the carpet. And instead of brushing her hands to my lips, I fall upon her hands. With a fervor I don't think she has ever experienced before in her Prime Minister. So that's actually what happened. There you go.
Stand right here. So I'm going to close with just a few words and a presentation. This in a minute. So first of all, I just want to say that we are so fortunate that we're going to have you back here next year to do the course again, and the year after that. You signed on for 3 years, which is fabulous for this university. But I also want to say that I think everyone in this audience and everyone that's been exposed to you at Yale during your time here must share what I feel. And that is not only that you have a marvelous sense of humor, which is obvious, but that this is quite a remarkable thing about you. Here you are, having been Prime Minister, leader of one of the great nations on earth, and yet you have, in the way you approach questions, in the way you have approached this teaching assignment, in the way that you live your life by values, an extraordinary capacity to be open and inquisitive and willing to learn. I mean, it's a marvelous thing to see, and we're an educational institution, and naturally we appreciate it, that it would be easy for someone of your achievement to close off, to think that you had nothing but things to do, but that all you needed to do was to teach others and impart the wisdom of your experience. But in truth, you're a lifelong learner. You're a model for all of us, and we're deeply grateful to have you here. And I have the best job in the world because I get him as a house guest every time he comes. And as a house guest, I know I've come to appreciate his habits. He's made use of the gym upstairs at the president's house. And so we've got a little, what do you say, kit, little gear, athletic, various Yale paraphernalia for working out in hotel gyms everywhere.
Thank you.